Welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today's discussion is entitled, What is Sovereign Democracy? Now, as all of these particular pieces are, everything from fascism, socialism, Christian democracy, social democracy, and of course sovereign democracy, these are all reactions to the failures of liberalism. Sovereign democracy is very, very different from the others in that it doesn't necessarily require democratically elected institutions to function. Now, let's get back to some important definitions. What is democracy? To liberal according to liberal theory, basically you can look at democracy as the role that elections play in determining who holds office and the policies that are produced, right? And this is a very formal way of looking at it. The problem is, as most people in most allegedly democratic countries, in fact, all countries around the world will tell you, just because a policy is popular and demanded by voters doesn't mean that it's going to take effect. Doesn't mean that it will, be passed into law, and the reason is that people in office very oftentimes have many different priorities to juggle, right? So Americans can clamor for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine forever, and our politicians aren't going to listen to us. Similarly, popular reforms that might, say, expand the requirements for background checks before somebody's allowed to purchase a firearm may be wildly popular even among gun owners, but it's not going to be passed because it's not the only priority that those in charge think about when they look at laws. So one of the major failures of liberal democracy is that liberal democracy very oftentimes uses elections to legitimize anti-democratic policy making, or at least anti-popular policy making. People can just be told, oh, well, you had an election, you had your say in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people actually had a say in the policies that came out of it. So the question of what is democracy and what does democracy mean, those are complicated questions and very heavily philosophical. Christian democracy embraced democratic institutions, election institutions, but did so with a different theory of state. Social democracy took the idea of procedural democracy from liberal democracy, but extended it out in ways that liberal democracy didn't contemplate, as well as localizing it and coming up with a very different theoretical basis of the state, one that I think was very heavily influenced by Christian democracy. Fascism left most of liberalism intact and just simply tried to address the impact of society, which I think says as much about liberalism as it does about fascism. But then let's come to sovereign democracy. Sovereign democracy is then a movement which comes out of Russia during the period of time when Dmitry Medvedev was Russian president. So first of all, you had Yeltsin. Yeltsin was the sort of liberal that sent tanks against the Senate when they didn't want to do what he wanted them to do. Yet we hold him up as the great democratizer of Russia. It's not really the case. Then came Putin's first time as president. relationships with NATO improved during that time, believe it or not. Then Putin had to step down for constitutional reasons, and he became prime minister, and Medvedev became president. And so one of Medvedev's major projects was trying to ground Russian governance theory philosophically, and the outcome of this was sovereign democracy. The idea of sovereign democracy is that sovereign democracy is a political state where a diverse Russian country comes together and is therefore able to make policy for mutual prosperity, freedom, and fairness for all the peoples that inhabit the country. What you're not going to hear about that is you're not going to hear, what are the structural requirements. You don't hear, because those are sort of aside from the point. The point is the purpose of the state is for diverse people to come together in order to achieve mutual prosperity, fairness, and these sorts of things. It's there for a diverse state to come together and solve its problems. So what sovereign democracy then suggests is that the measure of democracy isn't do you have elections to elect people, but rather is the government responsive to the needs of the diverse people. I would argue in the United States we're not, right? All these Black Lives Matter protesters, as far as national policy, anything change? Oh, I guess they've renamed some streets. Problems must be solved. No, I mean seriously, nothing changed on a national level. There were some local experiments, but those largely got snowed under very, very, very quickly. The United States is not a responsive country when it comes to addressing grievances of its people. And I think that we need to recognize that. On the other hand, the protests in China led to changes in, COVID policies. The protests in Iran led to changes in Iranian policy. Those countries, despite us calling them undemocratic, and the questions in particular in relation to Iran is a lot more complicated than that. The governments were much more responsive to the grievances of the people than we typically see in the United States. In fact, I can't think of any time that protests have changed policy since, the civil rights movement in the United States. And that was a massive set of very long-running, very bloody protests to even get there. So, my point here is that by a substantive metric, the United States has all the trappings of democracy, but substantively it's lacking. The aim of social democracy is to provide a moral compass for a government to be substantively democratic, regardless of how things work in terms of the procedural side. Russia does have elections. They do elect their president. They do elect their legislative bodies, but they're not a very liberal country. Same thing, Iran. Iran has elections that that elect the body that oversees the Council of Guardians and the Supreme Leader. They have elections that for the legislative bodies. They have elections for the Iranian president. You can think about Iran as being sort of structured kind of like the U.S., except that the Supreme Court has a lot more power, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in other words, the Supreme Leader, has even more power. It's not untethered from democratic institutions, but Iran doesn't look at democracy in a liberal way, and consequently we look at them as undemocratic not because they don't have elections, but because we want to discredit their elections. And that says, I think, a lot more about American politics than it does Iranian politics. So that's what I have to say about that. What I'm getting at here is that if we sovereign democracy very much is an idea that grievances of the people are things that the government needs to address. Okay. And I think probably most people agree with that, although, again, as I say, when you look at Western countries don't have a great track record there. I'll just put it out there. Then a second major point here, I think, I'm going to take from Michael Rossi, who's a political science professor, I believe at Cambridge, if I remember right. And Michael Rossi puts sovereign democracy in a general global trend that he calls stabilotocracy. Now, the way he looks at stabilotocracy is that you have the liberal world tends to look at the goal of the state being ordered liberty. And therefore, rights come first before social duties, national security, and so forth. Stabilotocracy is the idea that the state exists to protect the society from all threats, internal and external. And therefore, part of the reason for the state is to ensure a stable society. And he puts Erdogan, Orban, Putin, Xi, and many of the other leaders that the West calls autocratic, he actually says are more stabilocratic. And basically the stabilocratic argument is, well, if society falls apart, then you don't have rights anyway, so you can't put rights ahead of society's needs, because at least when they're existential threats to society, because rights are meaningless without society. I think there's something to that. But the fundamental question then becomes, how does the state function as a place where political disagreements and differing needs in relation to solutions to common problems can actually be hashed out? And that's a hard problem, right? Having a government that at least anchors its rhetoric in the idea that a diverse nation has to come together for mutual prosperity, security, and fairness and freedom is ultimately a good thing. I think that Western countries could actually learn from this, as well as acknowledge that when protests cause policy changes overseas, that is an indication of democratic focus in the state on a substantive level that, frankly, we haven't seen in the West in a long time. So, where am I going with this? I firmly believe that Western hegemony is fading into the basically fading from reality into history. The idea of sovereign democracy, I think, is something which is very much likely to inspire a lot of people in a lot of other countries, especially diverse countries, to come together and figure out how to build a responsive government to local needs. And ultimately, I think that's a good thing. So I'm hoping that this experiment from Russia actually bears positive fruit throughout the world. Anyway, That's all I have for you today. A link to Michael Rossi's YouTube channel. And he actually talks quite a lot more about sovereign democracy as well as stabilotocracy in some of his lecture series. So, at any rate, have a great one. I'll talk to you another time.